morning. This morning I'm reading from Acts 12:25 to 13:3, and then from 14:8 to 20. When Barnabas and Saul had finished their mission, they returned from Jerusalem, taking with them John, also called Mark. In the church at Antioch, there were prophets and teachers: Barnabas, Simeon called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. While they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them." So after they had fasted and prayed, they placed their hands on them and sent them off. And 14:8 to 20. In Lystra, there sat a man crippled in his feet, who was lame from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul as he was speaking. Paul looked directly at him and saw that he had faith to be healed, and called out, "Stand up on your feet." At that, the man jumped up and began to walk. When the crowd saw that what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bulls and wreaths to the city gates because he and the crowd wanted to offer sacrifices to them. But when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard this, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd, shouting, "Men, why are you doing this? We too are only men, human like you. We are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God, who made heaven and earth and sea and everything in them. In the past, he let all the nations go their own way, yet he has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with love." Even with these words, they had difficulty keeping the crowd from sacrificing to them. Then some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium and won the crowd over. They stoned Paul and dragged him outside the city, thinking he was dead. But after the disciples had gathered round him, he got up, went back into the city. The next day, he and Barnabas left for Derbe.
Thanks, Julie, and that was the correct Bible reading. You see how they are pretty similar. It was talking boldly, but I must have pulled the wrong one down. As it was playing, I thought, this doesn't look right. But we'll get there next when we get around to that in the series. Well, today we are beginning a new series from the book of Acts, picking up from where we left off last year in chapter 12, at the end of chapter 12. And as you may remember, when we went through the beginning of Acts and introduced Acts last year, we talked about the fact that Acts is a 2-volume book series written by Dr. Luke, the author of the Gospel of Luke. And while the two books aren't sitting together in the Bible like 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Corinthians and others are together in the way the Bible's been put together, Luke's intention was from the beginning that these two would be read together. These two books are one book in 2 parts. They tell the same story. They tell the gospel, the good news of Jesus, how this has gone out into the world. In his gospel, Luke focuses on Jesus' life and death and resurrection. And then in Acts, Luke's second volume, he focuses on how the Holy Spirit is at work in the life and the witness and the ministry of the local church, the church that came into existence after Jesus returned to heaven, taking the good news from Jerusalem out to the ends of the world. We see three movements of the spread of the good news in the book of Acts. In chapters 1 to 7, we see the apostles proclaiming the gospel right there in Jerusalem. If you're not familiar where all this is, here's Jerusalem down here. And then from chapters 8 to 12, as persecution starts coming into Jerusalem amongst the Christians and they scatter, the gospel moves further out beyond Jerusalem into Judea and Samaria and even crossing the border of Israel. And then in chapters 13 to 21, where we are in this series, we see Paul and others proclaiming the gospel, going out on missionary trips, out to the ends of the then world, in that part of the world, telling people the good news of Jesus. The last chapter finishing with Paul as he goes to Rome and is imprisoned there before he is killed. So before we get to the passage this morning that we're going to start looking at, that Julie has read to us, I want to give a quick recap of where we've got to in this part of the story in Acts. Saul was a Jewish Pharisee, a teacher of Jewish law. And he'd been persecuting Christians in Jerusalem, rounding them up, imprisoning them, taking them back to the prison wherever he could find them. And on the road to do that, going up to Damascus, on the road to Damascus, Saul has this experience, this encounter with the risen Jesus. And as a result of that encounter, decides to follow Jesus and is a believer. Barnabas, who we heard in the story, was instrumental in convincing the Jewish leaders back in Jerusalem that Paul's conversion was genuine. It was the real thing. He wasn't masquerading as a Christian and coming to infiltrate the church. He was a believer. Well, meanwhile, the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem, when they heard that Paul had had a turnaround in his life and was now following Jesus, not persecuting those who followed Jesus, they have plans to kill him. And so for Saul's own safety, the the Christian leaders send Paul to Tarsus, to his hometown up here around in the northern part of from Israel. About 10 years later, in chapter 11, the Jerusalem church sends Barnabas to Antioch, this little town up in here, and where the gospel was taking root and great things were happening. A church had been birthed. Many people were becoming Christians, and so they sent Barnabas up there to encourage the church. And while there, he travels across to Tarsus to find Saul, brings him back to Antioch, and they spend the next year encouraging the church and teaching the church there in Antioch. At the beginning of chapter 13, the church in Antioch sets Barnabas and Saul apart. They commission them to go out as missionaries from this church and take the gospel beyond Antioch. And that's where we pick up the story today. If you are confused with the names of Paul and Saul, it is the same person. Saul actually changes his name or starts referring to himself and being called Paul later in chapter 13. So Paul and Barnabas go out and face tough opposition pretty much from the get-go. They have a run-in with the wizard in Cyprus. They get publicly contradicted in Antioch, not the Antioch they've just come from, this Antioch up in here. There's two Antiochs there. This is the one that they're now taking the gospel to, and find this people just yelling, you're wrong, publicly in front of them. They're chucked out of town. In Iconium, they hear about a plot to kill them, and so they move on and flee to Lystra and Derbe. And there things get even more intense. There was an Anglican bishop who, after visiting a church to preach, complained to a member of the church, wherever Paul went, he caused riots. Wherever I go, they give me cups of tea. Well, as we'll discover this morning, Paul certainly, a lot of riots came out as a result of Paul and Barnabas' teaching not only just in this story, but as we go through the other parts of Acts over the next few weeks. We'll get to enjoy a cup of tea and coffee after the service. So what did Paul and Barnabas do in the face of all this opposition? They simply kept on going, proclaiming the gospel, encouraging people in Jesus, raising up leaders to carry on the work of shepherding the church, because they knew that opposition and persecution wasn't something to be avoided, not even actively chased after, but a natural byproduct of what happens when you proclaim Jesus boldly, what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And it's the exact same story today. I'm borrowing this outline from Michael Calder. God's people in a lost world, that's who we are. Faithfully proclaiming the gospel, patiently enduring hardships and opposition. But we don't do this alone, but with the ultimate support, which we're going to cover those various aspects today as we go through. So first, a lost world. Lystra was an outpost, a frontier town of the Roman Empire. Caesar Augustus had made it a Roman garrison city in 6 BC and established it as the easternmost fort in the Galatia Peninsula. It was a rough place. Think the American Wild West. I tried to come up with an Australian town that would be similar to that, and I don't want to ostracize certain towns around the country, so we'll just stick with the American Wild West. Most of the population was uneducated. In fact, they were quite barbaric in the way they lived their lives. They had their own language. The Romans ruled the land, but the Greeks controlled business. The Jews were very insignificant and in the place had little influence. In fact, there wasn't even a Jewish synagogue in the town. But Paul and Barnabas get there, and their ministry gets off to a great start as they arrive in this town. A man who has been paralyzed is healed. Verse 8. In Lystra there sat a man who was lame. He'd been that way since birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul as he was speaking, and Paul looked directly at him and saw that he had faith to be healed and called out, "Stand up on your feet." And at that the man jumped up and began to walk. Paul at this point has everybody's undivided attention. As this disabled man, everybody would have known this man in the town, as this man was dancing and jumping up and down in front of the people. And Paul's now thinking, now I can start sharing the gospel, sharing Jesus with the people. Tell them where this power, this miraculous miracle comes from. And God willing, maybe many people will put their faith in Jesus. That's what Paul would be expecting to happen at this point. Except there's one major complication. The Lycaonians believed an ancient legend about two Greek gods, Zeus and Hermes, who'd once come up into the hill country around the town, disguised as mortals looking for somewhere to stay. And though they asked 1,000 homes if they could come and stay in their homes, no one would take them in. Until they found an elderly couple living in a little cottage made of straw and sticks. And this elderly couple welcomed them in and gave them what food they had. In appreciation for their kindness, this legend goes that the gods transformed their cottage into a temple and destroyed the village for their inhospitality. And the Lycaonians here today in this story did not want that same thing to happen again. So when they saw this happen, they thought, these could be Greek gods again. And so they determined not to make the same mistake. Verse 11, when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us," again, in human form. Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just out the city, brought bulls and wreaths to the city gates because he and the crowd wanted to offer sacrifices to them. Barnabas obviously was of noble character, so he was called Zeus. Well, they called him Zeus, the chief god in the Greek pantheon of gods. Paul was the spokesman, so they called him Hermes, the messenger of the gods. At this point, Paul and Barnabas don't know what's going on here. People are speaking Laconian. They don't understand that. But it's beginning to turn into a circus. What had started off with such promise was about to be ruined. When the chief priests come along with these sacrificial bulls decorated with garlands around their horns, Paul and Barnabas are horrified. Now they understand what is going on in this town. Verse 14, but when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of this, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd, shouting, friends, why are you doing this? We too are only human, just like you. Now, tearing their robes was a Hebrew way of showing disgust at sacrilege which was taking place. And then Paul and Barnabas start calling, hey guys, stop it. We're just men like you. Look, 5 fingers, 5 toes. Oh, sorry, 10 fingers, 10 toes. Maybe let's do one at a time. So the people of Lystra were lost people, following pagan rituals, controlled by ancient myths that have been carried down from generation to generation, even wanting to worship humans. Now, when we think today in 2025 of lost people, we might be thinking of people living in cultures where whole of life and whole of society centers around worshipping idols and animism and superstition, ancestor worship. And we say, lost people. But what about Australia? Are we too different from this? We may not worship Greek gods or stone idols, but plenty of people worship celebrities and sports and careers and possessions and money. Any people without God, without hope, are just as lost as the people of Lystra. And Paul and Barnabas, as they see what's happening in this town, are horrified. Horrified that the crowds want to worship them. And so they attempt to bring the people back to the God of creation, the Lord of all, the one true God. So here the crowd is loud, bustling, shouting, getting all worked up over what they think are gods in their midst. Paul and Barnabas trying to put wreaths on Paul and Barnabas and sacrifice these bulls in front of them. And over the top of the crowds, Paul attempts to proclaim the gospel. Verse 15. We're bringing you the good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them. Paul desperately wants them to know that he and Barnabas are not the good news. They really aren't anything special, and that worshipping them is absolutely worthless because there's only one living God, and they aren't him. They're just the messengers, his creation, not the creator. And this is the crux of Paul's message to these pagan people. Turn from worshipping the things that are created and instead worship the creator. God is the one who spoke the earth into being. God is the one in his kindness who has provided everything that people have, like rain. He talks about rain, crops, food, even joy, even love. God is the source of all things seen and unseen. And he's made himself known to all of humanity in his magnificent creation. In February, Glenda and I spent 2 wonderful weeks camping on the New South Wales south coast. And it's a beautiful part of the country. Stunning white sandy beaches, rock cliffs and rocks, coastal, rocky coastal coastline, luscious forests. And as we sat on this point, looking out to sea and the waves crashing in on the rocks below, the video is much more impressive than kind of a flat photo like this. We couldn't help but look at this and see the hand of God at work around us. It was obvious. You could not deny this didn't just happen by chance. God was in what we saw on this coast. It's like King David said of the sky in Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. And yet, God's created beings still insist on worshipping the creation, not the Creator. That's what the people of Lystra are doing. And Paul tries to point them back, let them see the Creator behind everything they saw. And apparently this area of the country, of the world, was a beautiful snow-capped mountains in Lystra. It's a stunning place that they lived among. But notice what Paul is doing here. Flick back to chapter 13. Paul is speaking here in chapter 13 in a synagogue, a Jewish synagogue in Antioch. And he preaches from the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament that we know today. And he tells the people how Jesus is the fulfillment of all the Jewish law, the long-awaited Messiah who'd been prophesied for years, centuries before. That's his message to a Jewish congregation. But here in chapter 14, in the pagan city of Lystra, he doesn't focus on Scriptures that the people don't know anything about. He doesn't mention the law or the prophecy that he'd just spoken about in Antioch. Instead, he uses language, he uses concepts that the people know and understand. He focuses on the natural world around them, what they know, what they can see, and uses that as a springboard to share the gospel. He's still preaching the gospel, but he's contextualizing it, serving it up to the people in a way they will understand, they will comprehend, and they will be able to respond to. In Australia today, we've moved away from being a nominal Christian country where people know a little bit at least about Jesus and the Bible, to a society where there is little or no knowledge of who Jesus is, little or no knowledge of the Bible, no knowledge of God, no knowledge of God's character. Which means that we have an amazing opportunity to present the gospel, to share the good news in fresh ways to the people, to share it in a way that makes sense to people. We can change the packaging of the gospel. There are many ways to share it, as long as we don't change the message, the central part, which is all about Jesus. We have to begin where people are, to find a point of contact with them. What it means to be a human, the hunger that everybody has, the love and acceptance and community, the search for identity, the search for personal significance, issues that people are concerned about, justice, environmental and economic security. John Stott, who was a great proponent of sharing the gospel contextually, said, wherever we begin, we shall end with Jesus Christ, who is himself the good news and who alone can fulfill all human aspirations. That's what Paul and Barnabas are doing here in Lystra, pointing to the people the beauty of creation, the things that they can see around them as a way of talking about the Creator and his kindness and goodness to the people. And from that, his plan would have been to talk about Jesus, God's greatest gift to humanity. But Paul and Barnabas' message isn't received too well. The crowd is still in a riot, going crazy. But there's worse to come. Some Jewish leaders in the towns that Paul and Barnabas have just visited arrive in town and turn the crowd against them even more. In verse 19. Then some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium and won the crowd over. They stoned Paul and dragged him outside the city, thinking he was dead. It's astonishing how fickle this crowd has become. In 1 minute, they're trying to make sacrifices to these people they think are gods. And the next minute, they're stoning Paul to an inch of his life, stoning him as a criminal. Brings back some parallels to what we've just experienced at Easter, doesn't it, with Jesus? A stoning was, and in many countries that still practice this, still is a barbaric and cruel thing to do to somebody. As the rocks crashed down on Paul's body and his skull. I wonder if Paul, his mind, flashes back to the stoning of Stephen, an act that he was actually participating in on the sidelines. Soon, Paul is laying there, blood spattered, his body broken, laying under a pile of Lystra rubble. And the disciples gather around him, thinking, what are we going to do with his body? They thought he was dead. Tears streaming down their faces. What a pity. He was in the prime of his ministry. If only he could have lived longer. And suddenly, Paul pops up one eye open and then another and says, hey guys, it's me, I'm alive. There's no funeral today, let's get going. And then battered, bruised, sore, hobbling probably, Paul makes his way with Barnabas back into the city. Back to the people who just tried to kill him. What an incredible witness of this man. Caked in blood and dirt. He must have been quite a spectacle. But nothing could deter Paul and Barnabas from bravely preaching Jesus. Just a side note here on Lystra. Lystra was the city where a young Timothy lived with his mother Eunice and his grandmother Lois. In chapter 16, as we'll come to in a few weeks, Paul returns to Lystra and recruits Timothy as his ministry intern. And Timothy goes on to become a leader in the church. But right now, Paul and Barnabas are there as beaten, or Paul is a beaten person. And they decide to leave Lystra. They travel 100 kilometers to Derbe. And Paul and Barnabas could have easily quit right then and there. Packed up, gone home. I think after the reception that they'd received, insults being thrown at them, the abuse, the stoning of Paul until he was assumed dead. They went back onto Iconium, a city that threatened to kill them. Even the threat of persecution didn't stop Paul from moving on, fulfilling their mission. They didn't see persecution was bad or something to be avoided, but a natural thing that would happen when they proclaimed Jesus. Verse 21, we see this, the end of verse 21. When they returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch, strengthening the disciples, encouraging them to remain true in the faith. We must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God, they said. Rejection and persecution and pressure is a natural outworking of being one of God's people and proclaiming the gospel. And this shouldn't be a surprise to us. It wasn't for the apostles. It shouldn't be a surprise to us. Jesus says in Luke chapter 23, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will save it. When we follow Jesus, we are called to suffer. We're commanded to give up our lives to serve him, to take up our cross as an instrument of death and torture that Jesus took up for us and follow in his footsteps. Yes, Jesus' yoke is easy. His burden is light. But as we saw a couple of weeks ago when we looked at the invitation of Jesus, Jesus doesn't call us to a life of ease and a life of comfort, but a life of sacrifice, a life of serving him. And when we receive the crown of glory, when the kingdom of comes to its fulfillment, the hardships that we experience in this life will disappear in a twinkling of an eye as he wipes every tear from our eyes. In Melbourne today, it's relatively easy to be a Christian. We aren't being openly persecuted or shut down or shut up in prison. We're free to meet. We're free to practice our faith. We're relatively free to share Jesus, proclaim his truth. We might face ridicule. We might face people ignoring us. Maybe if we spoke up more, if we shared our faith more overtly, if we proclaimed our beliefs more vocally, we'd get a different response. But we probably have got a little bit comfortable about being comfortable. This isn't to say that we need to go looking for trouble, looking for persecution. I'm not saying that at all. But we need to remember that many, many Christians around the world today, for them, following Jesus means constant persecution, attacks, threats against their lives, even for many, death. If we aren't going out of our comfort zones, I say this to myself as well, if we aren't going out of our comfort zones to tell people about Jesus, are we going far enough? Potentially not. There's a lost world all around us that needs Jesus. And he's commissioned us, he's called us to go and tell them the good news, even if it means enduring hardships. But the good news in all of this is that as we go out, we have the assurance that we are not going out ourselves. We have the best and ultimate support. And this support has two elements. First, as Paul and Barnabas go out back through the towns they visited earlier, they appoint elders in the churches as they go around. Elders to strengthen and build up the believers in these new growing churches. We have the support of each other as we go out. This isn't a mission that we're called to by ourselves. We go out together. We can pray for each other. We can encourage each other as we go. It's not a solo effort. It's the whole body working together, each using their gifts, each using their abilities to strengthen the body, to encourage it, to build it up. And secondly, it's not our work. We're not doing our work. It is us participating in God's work in the world. At the very end of this passage, Paul and Barnabas get back to Antioch, the town where they were commissioned to go from, in verse 27. On arriving there, they gathered the church together and reported all that God had done through them and how he had opened up a door of faith to the Gentiles. And they stayed there a long time with the disciples. Again, getting encouragement from the body, ready for their next mission trip. The only reason people came to faith in Jesus through the ministry of Paul and Barnabas is because God had done it through them. It's all God's work. And we get the privilege of partnering with God, with his Spirit. He's at work in us as we go out into the world. He's with us as we go. Which means that we're never alone. We're never alone as we go witnessing for Jesus. Perhaps you're in a workplace or living in a retirement village and it seems like you're the only Christian there. You're there all by yourself. Or you're in a family that doesn't yet know Jesus, follow Jesus, and you feel isolated, even in your own family. Or maybe you're studying at uni and it seems like a totally secular, totally anti-Christ place. And you don't feel confident in sharing Jesus in that place. Well, know that you aren't there alone. You aren't isolated. The Holy Spirit is with you to encourage you, to strengthen you, to give you the words to say, to open up opportunities for you to share, and then the words to say in that opportunity. we have the best support possible, not only in God's people, but in God himself with us. We're called to be God's people. That's not the one. We're called to be God's people in a lost world, faithfully proclaiming the gospel, patiently enduring hardships and opposition. But we don't do this alone. We do it with the ultimate support of other Christians and our ever-present, all-powerful God with us. Let's pray.